No, there was a very distinct move to bring Bond back to Earth.
Darker, grittier, more realistic. For a while, it was something we came to expect, from Superman to Snow White.
Because we were all thinking, all right, we're not going to extend this. We're going to go back to its roots, if you would, and start, right, and build again.
But, like every trend worth its salt, the gritty reboot had to be a good idea at least a few times. Even something that's become a tired cliche had, in its past, a window of actually invigorating creativity.
Our inspirations for Batman Begins, filmically, they were non-Batman films. They were movies like Lawrence of Arabia, Man Who Would Be King.
In the mid-2000s, two of cinema's biggest franchises reinvented themselves at the same time, creating a high watermark for the trend and bringing a Hollywood shorthand into the mainstream consciousness. Here's how Batman and Bond became the best of the gritty reboots. Where the gritty reboot is concerned, the trend saw its pinnacle in 2005 and 2006, with Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins and Martin Campbell's Casino Royale. On top of both being very good, the two films were created using incredibly similar recipes. Both are entries into franchises that date back to the 1960s, both are the only true origin story on film for either Batman or James Bond, and both take a decidedly more grounded approach than their predecessors. And the legacies of both have benefited from hitting a high water mark for reboots. Of course, nearly every trend follows a pattern, and the gritty reboot is no different. First, there's the introduction of a new idea. Second comes an intriguing building period as creatives suss out just what the value of this new idea is. Third, there's the zenith, where form and function work together and something genuinely great comes out of it. And fourth comes, well, everything else. Usually a slow decline that wears out the idea's welcome.
What the hell are you?
Reboots were, of course, nothing new by the mid-2000s. 90s cinemas were littered with 60s TV show reboots from Lost in Space to The Avengers to The Saint, while Bond and Batman saw more subtle tweaks to their respective formulas in the decade.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
Martin Campbell directed not only Casino Royale, but also Pierce Brosnan's first outing as Bond in 1995's GoldenEye, which, to the director's mind, didn't really count as a reboot.
I was just thinking, well, it's a Bond film, let's pull it into the 90s, let's sort of make it our own, basically, which is what we did. It was not so much a reboot as an extension of, now we had Pierce and so forth. It was 7 years later, we had to, we were very much aware of, is it past its sell-by date? So that was the challenge.
Meanwhile, in 90s Gotham, 3 actors and 2 very different directors took a crack at portraying Batman.
The last Batman film that had come out prior to Batman Begins was, I think, Batman and Robin, which was the 4th in a series, and as the series had progressed, the movies had become increasingly more comical, more like the Adam West TV show, goofier. They didn't really take themselves seriously. And as the series progressed, it also became less successful.
But simply recasting or hiring a new director does not a reboot make. Certainly not a gritty reboot. For Batman Begins and Casino Royale, their more grounded approach has roots a decade earlier and in a different medium. Comics in particular saw a trend in the 80s leaning into darker stories aimed at adult audiences. This includes titles like Alan Moore's Watchmen and Frank Miller's work with characters like Daredevil. Most notable, where Batman Begins is concerned, was Miller's work with the Caped Crusader himself in The Dark Knight Returns and the gritty reimagining of Bruce Wayne's origins in Batman Year One. Miller's Batman is, to this day, some of the more enduring work with the character, so here we start to see the stars aligning. The Caped Crusader was both primed for something new and had a proven track record for it.
Does it come in black?
In 1997, Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin was not gritty, dark, or realistic, to say the least. It was a flashy, over-the-top box office failure that, frankly, I'm comfortable saying nobody liked. Lorenzo di Bonaventura was president of feature production at Warner Brothers in the years when they were trying to figure out what to do next.
We saw that version had run its course, and that we were going to have to embrace another course.
The same can be said for 2002's Die Another Day, the flashy, over-the-top box office failure that was the Bond entry prior to Casino Royale.
The thing was that the previous Bond, I get a bit mixed up with the titles, Die Another Day was it? I think with invisible cars with ice palaces and snowboarding off kind of ice flows and so forth. It was too much. I think it just got to the point of it was starting to lose it, as it were. And the producers knew it too. They just felt it had just gone too far, and they had to do something to pull it back.
Both of these storied franchises found themselves at a crossroads. The fact that they'd both been trending downward, critically and commercially for some time, created an environment where studios were willing to give just about anything a try.
So to a certain extent, the Batman franchise was in the dumps. It had been degraded. And so I think it was because of that Warner Brothers was willing to try something, in their opinion, more extreme, which is ironic because extreme meant just really taking it seriously.
How we perceived comic books, graphic novels, was changing at that moment. And that is the reason, in part, why the Frank Miller was embraced, is because we began to look at them with a greater appreciation as a company, if you would. And I think we were a little ground setting in that respect, and it helped. And I don't know if we were the exact first ones to do it that way, but that is what happened over the next few years in the movie business, is that comic books became more elevated in what they represented.
Batman, of course, had already seen a seismic shift in tone once before. Tim Burton's Batman in 1989 was a dark, gothic dreamscape, particularly compared to the almost vaudevillian original series from the 60s. But more than 20 years had passed between the two. Bond, meanwhile, had never quite pivoted so drastically, instead enjoying a gradual, decades-long slide from Cold War-era kitsch and spycraft to invisible cars, with a few minor course corrections along the way. Bond producers would ultimately turn to franchise veterans Neil Purvis and Robert Wade to write Casino Royale, while Batman went looking for fresh-faced auteurs like Darren Aronofsky and, of course, Christopher Nolan.
When Chris took Batman, he really needed a take for himself to convince himself that he could do it, So to me, when you suddenly have a very talented filmmaker willing to jump into a space like this, you jump right with them.
It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me.
Bruce?
When Chris and I started working on Batman Begins, the idea of doing something grounded was pretty baked into the concept. First of all, Chris tends to be a very grounded filmmaker. I would say it was Chris as a filmmaker, to a lesser extent my own desire to do something more serious, more like the Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams Batmans, or more like, Miller's Batmans. And then just the fact that the franchise was broken.
Batman Begins was a hard reboot, an origin story stretching past Pearls hitting the ground in slow motion. The film explored what it would take to make a man dress up like a bat and go full vigilante to an extent not seen in previous entries in the Batman franchise. He travels the world to turn his hate and privilege into something productive. There's a grounded nature, at least an explanation for everything from the Batmobile to the bat suit. Introducing the character of Rachel Dawes was unlike any other Batman film as well. She became just as tied to Bruce's origins as Batman as those slow-motion pearls, and became a love interest that had actual bearing on Bruce as a character and on what it means to be Batman. And to top it all off, it worked. The film was a commercial and critical success, which meant a brand new direction for the Batman franchise and a tipping point for the gritty reboot as a viable trend.
So you want me to be half monk, half hitman?
Any thug can kill. I want you to take your ego out of the equation and to judge the situation dispassionately.
They had the rights to Casino Royale, so we all went into that saying we have to completely reboot this thing. We have to bring it back to earth and really make it grittier, tougher, make a tougher Bond, much more like the books. And if you read the book, Craig is much more like the original Bond character, much more serious. and a darker Bond.
Like Batman, the James Bond franchise was missing a proper origin story for its hero. Despite recasting across half a century, the producers had never ventured into Bond's first outing as a 00. One thing the franchise has always done, though, is adjust to the latest trends. Blaxploitation was on the rise in the early 70s, so it's time to make Live and Let Die.
Relax, baby. Mr. Big's gonna take care of you in a minute.
The most obvious example came at the end of The Spy Who Loved Me. In theaters, the closing titles read James Bond will return and for your eyes only. However, a film called Star Wars was released just a few months prior to The Spy Who Loved Me, so the producers decided to make Moonraker next instead. All that to say, when they saw the success Batman Begins had in 2005, Bond did what Bond does and adapted to the landscape. While Neil Purvis and Robert Wade wrote the initial draft, Paul Haggis was brought in late 2005 to polish the script and even told reporters explicitly where his inspiration came from, by saying, "We're trying to do for Bond what Batman Begins did for Batman." Admittedly, the story in 2006's Casino Royale is more or less a direct narrative adaptation of the original Ian Fleming novel. So, Vesper Lynd, the love interest that has a real impact on Bond's character, a notable departure for the franchise, had always been part of Casino Royale. However, the formula that had been entrenched in the Bond franchise since Goldfinger, a colorful villain with an outlandish plot to destabilize the world featuring idiosyncratic henchmen and an Aston Martin full of gadgets at Bond's disposal, was certainly not the focus of Casino Royale. Instead, there's a weightier investigation into Bond's motivations and what drove him to become the cold bastard he's been on screen all these years. And so, the gritty reboot had two shiny new calling cards. Two of the most iconic characters of all time had successfully navigated the darker, more tonally realistic waters and come out shiny, new, and profitable. There is, however, that fourth part of the trend pattern. One success may be a fluke, but two is a sure thing in Hollywood. The 1-2 punch of Batman Begins and Casino Royale spawned a reshaping of any franchise that felt the need to reboot.
I remember after Batman Begins, I was invited to various studios to see if we could do the Batman Begins or the Dark Knight version of various other franchises. I remember at one point Paramount wanted me to do the Dark Knight version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or everything was the Dark Knight version of this, or the Batman Begins version of that.
David S. Goyer would of course go on to write the screenplay for Man of Steel, setting a darker tone for the entire Snyder-verse. Planet of the Apes came back with a prequel reboot that riffs on the ideas presented in the originals, but played it much darker by the time they were done. The Andrew Garfield Spider-Man films, the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmeses, Fantastic Four, Snow White and the Huntsman, they all came to theaters with the same darker color palette and determination to explore more dramatic themes in the wake of Batman Begins and Casino Royale.
And I think after the success of those films, I think for a while you saw this proliferation of really dark takes. But the most successful versions are products of their time, and these things are cyclical. So after having seen a ton of these really dark movies, sometimes it's nice to go back again and see something that's really joyous or something that isn't dark.
The gritty reboot seems to have run its course for the moment, giving way to the cheerier universe-hopping fare you find in the MCU. But the trend will undoubtedly have another day in the gritty sun. At some point, films will start leaning back in that direction, then a couple will break through and really work, and then, well...
Left to their own devices, Hollywood is always going to just repeat and repeat and repeat until the audience gets sick of it.
The name's Bond. James Bond.